Hello, Connor.
Hey, Bob, how you doing?
I can't complain. I guess I'll start by introducing us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the NonZero newsletter. And what else? This is the NonZero podcast.
Right.
You're Connor Eccles, managing editor of the NonZero newsletter and currently guest editor for a couple more weeks of The Earthling. A real honor. Has that gone
Yeah.
to your head? Are you
It started to go to my head, but you've kept me in check by becoming sort of the guest host of Non-Zero World. So there's almost a trade there, right? So, I feel
no?
humbled still.
I figured like I had to do some kind of offshore balancing thing, lest you take total control of my media empire.
That's right.
Um, but anyway, it's nice of you to do that while I'm crashing to finish a book. But the hyper crash phase will end soon, and we hope. So speaking of which, the book is about AI, and I was just talking to somebody yesterday who said, "I can't believe AI and Trump are hitting us at the same time," and it's like it's true. I want to talk about both at some point in this conversation, but like, what do you got cooking in the Earthling? Like during this period when you're seeking total immediate empire domination, I'm not even like most of the Earthling. I haven't even seen, even though you're going to
Yeah,
press the publish button soon.
that's right. Yeah. Well, the big piece this week, the lead item is going to have a title to the effect of Trump's very good, very bad week on Ukraine. It's been a bit of a whirlwind, I'm sure people have seen, right? So the big news item, last week, obviously, you had Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth talking about some things in Europe. By the end of the week, you had heard that there was going to be a meeting between American and Russian officials in Saudi Arabia, and that meeting took place on Tuesday. They sort of hammered out an introductory set of agreements to get the talks started. Those include really basic things. One of the four things that they agreed was just to keep talking, which
Good, good.
one ought to do if you're doing negotiations. But the other ones are these sort of straightforward things around, you want to make sure to sort of normalize diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Russia, or start the process of doing so. You want to make sure that you set up a process for a deal that will work and be sustainable for all sides of the conflict. And then the third big one was just to seek areas of cooperation that might emerge out of this between the U.S. and Russia. So if you just look very narrowly at that, and if you only focus on the very official things that happened, you would think that this was a pretty much perfect week. It's very hard to argue with those initial agreements. And even,
Yeah.
it shows, I linked to a Quincy Institute report that came out this week that made the very good point that, Ukraine in direct negotiations with Russia, if the negotiations are only about the war, Ukraine has very limited leverage. But if the negotiations are about Russian relations with the United States, Ukraine gets a great deal more leverage. There's a lot
Great.
more that Russia can gain.
How does that work?
Well, the idea being that if we're only talking about if there's a possibility of a broader kind of cooling of relations, sanctions being removed, all of these things have to happen in concert with the West, right? If you're just talking about the narrow battlefield questions, and that is the only thing that's being negotiated, then Russia
Yeah.
has the advantage because Russia is winning this war right now. But if you expand it to the broader European security architecture, if you expand it to include, potential arms talks and things like that, or normalization of relations between the U.S. and Russia, those types of things are much bigger points of leverage that
But
can
is
be
it is
used to
it
Ukraine's
because
advantage.
Ukraine per se has leverage, or because Western Europe has leverage and they care more about Ukraine per se than Trump seems to?
It's that Ukraine has very little leverage on its own, but if so, as long as you're willing to bring in the broader issues, then you can have both the leverage of Western Europe, the leverage of the United States brought to bear to help create the best possible solution for Ukraine. That would
Right.
be
But
the idea.
I guess my question is, so these sanctions that would be, involved in a larger deal, the idea is Western Europe has to agree, and so there's leverage that's not totally in the hands of the U.S. I mean, it's not so much because
the,
Ukraine has to agree, is it, or is it? What decision can Ukraine make? Where can Ukraine say yes or no in a way that matters to the larger deal?
Well, Ukraine, I mean, could say yes or no to anything. Obviously, they need to be in agreement for a deal to work. But the idea is that if you're not willing to talk about the broader issues, which is what the Biden administration was signaling, they didn't want to talk about the European security architecture. They didn't want to talk about NATO. They didn't want to talk about, maybe security guarantees could be part of it, but they weren't willing to phrase that as a concession. Trump is bringing in all of these issues, these broader questions of the European and American relationship with Ukraine, and making it possible for those to be negotiated, which creates broader possibilities for what Ukraine could be trading, right? There's a more complicated set of deals.
So in other words, we're mainly talking about questions that Russia once raised,
right,
and Biden wouldn't have raised. Now, security guarantees per se, once you accept the grim reality that membership in NATO is very unlikely to be part of a final deal, Biden would have said, yeah, you need the security guarantees, but other things that Russia would like, I guess, including the alleviation of sanctions, you're saying is a conversation that Ukraine, one way or another, has leverage over.
Well, it's a conversation that allows Ukraine, if we're talking about on one side, the U.S., Ukraine, and Europe, and on the other side, Russia, then Ukraine has limited leverage if the U.S. is not able to back it and coordinate on these things. It has much greater leverage if it does. So that's the philosophy of talks that Trump seems to be following, and that I think makes a lot of sense, right? It's that, again, narrow negotiations about the war give Russia the advantage. Broad negotiations give the ability for the U.S. in coordination with Europe to create concessions that help Ukraine, that are broader than Ukraine's only threat being that it's going to continue this war, which is a very narrow threat that Russia doesn't seem all that worried about in the short term. But the problem is that amid all of these kind of good big picture ideas and amid all these interesting things, you've had Trump kind of throwing just random bits of dynamite sort of around at every possible turn. So he's now taken to calling Zelensky a dictator, claiming that he has a 4% approval rating, trying to foist this deal on him whereby the U.S. would take over something like half of Ukraine's mineral rights in exchange for our assistance. So all of those things obviously militate against the possibility of a deal, and also damage the possibility of sincere cooperation between, the Europe, U.S., and Ukraine, right? This is just complicating for relations across the board. So that's the very bad part from my perspective.
Yeah, I have a lot of bad parts. I mean, I have some good parts. I mean, it's funny, broadly speaking, I'm part of the restraint community, not in favor of militarism generally, and I was somebody who's been saying for a long time we should push Ukraine toward the negotiating table. In fact, I as you're by now tired of hearing me saying, and some listeners no doubt are, I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post at the end of 2022 saying now's the time to cut a deal. It's, Ukraine has had these recent successes on the battlefield. It's unlikely to continue, as indeed it didn't. But Biden will have to play bad cop to get the Ukrainian people to accept, and say, I'm not going to keep arming you if you don't go to the table. While, of course, saying to Russia, I am going to keep arming Ukraine if you don't go to the table. So I was singing in unison with the restraint choir on that issue, but I don't feel as festive as some of them seem to feel. Like when Pete Hegseth said Ukraine can't be part of NATO and it's not going to get all of its territory back, both those things are true, but whether it was a good idea to say them out loud at this point in the negotiations is another question. But anyway, I didn't feel like celebrating for a couple of reasons. And one of the points I would add to your reasons not to be to feel unadulterated joy right now is that it gets back to another thing I said right after the invasion, I think in the NonZero newsletter. Everybody was saying, oh my God, totalitarian, authoritarian, autocratic, whatever countries invaded a democracy. I said, that's not the issue. It doesn't matter whether Ukraine is a democracy. They have violated the bedrock principle of the UN Charter against transborder aggression. That's the most important principle to uphold. That's what Russia has done wrong, leaving aside the fact that I and many restrainers agree that it took super inept U.S. foreign policy to get us to a point where Russia would invade Ukraine. Still, Russia invaded Ukraine. They're the ones who broke the law. That's the principle to uphold.
Right.
So when Trump, as he is, yes, maybe, winding down the war, he's saying, oh, and by the way, I may invade Panama, I may bomb Mexico, I may seize Greenland by force, and not only saying these things, but starting to demand specific things in some cases in exchange for not doing that. Well, he's doing as much damage to the norm of complying with the international law against transborder aggression as previous presidents have done, which is saying something because they've done a lot in different ways. Right. I would say especially Clinton and George W. Bush. But all the others, including Trump, won, and including to some extent Biden, although maybe in this specific regard, Biden deserves the least blame. But so I'm just, the whole, I just can't get excited about Trump's foreign policy. I mean, it's and also, he just seems so obviously, he just can't keep himself under control,
right,
enough to just steer this thing to the finish line. I mean, maybe it'll happen, but this whole spat over calling him a dictator, I mean, look, it gets back to my point. No, Ukraine was not a paragon of liberal democracy. I made that point early on, but I said that shouldn't be the issue. I mean, obviously, it's closer to being a democracy than Russia is. And I will say further that, as for the dictator, Zelensky declared martial law during the war. Not unheard of. Ukrainian law dictates, no pun intended, that you not hold presidential elections under martial law. And Trump, obviously, there's a real chance he will declare martial law over the next 4 years under much flimsier, pretext.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know. It's like, there are people in the restraint community who were supporting Trump in the first place and are celebrating certain aspects of what he's doing. And at one level, I get it because I understand, like, conservative restrainers especially care much less about international law than I do generally. I kind of get that. I still don't see how any sensible person could be optimistic about the world with Trump at the helm.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth, maybe it's worth trying to make the strongest. There are, the thing is, Trump, I don't know, the way that I've been looking at it is that he sort of will do one thing that I like and then two things that I hate, something sort of to that extent, basically. And but he is signaling, there is a world in which he finds a much better balance in a world of great power competition or whatever you want to call it than Biden was able to. And setting aside, and it's hard to set aside all the damage that he'll do in the process, but there is a real chance that this could be an era in which we see less tensions, at least at that top level. Because I get the sense, when Trump talks about Russia or when he talks about China, there's a respect that's different than when he talks about other countries. He doesn't talk about Panama and China in the same way. And he doesn't even talk about Europe or like France and China or Russia in the same way. He seems to view Russia and China as, peers to be negotiated with and to be dealt with. And that recognition is a really big deal.
Yeah, but here, and I don't think this is so much him, the problem is so much him as the people he's put in his administration.
Yeah.
There is a vein of China hawkism in his administration.
Totally.
And like right now, you hear that he's going to try to pry Russia away from China and get Russia on our side. That is like the stupidest fucking kind of
Crazy.
realpolitik I've ever heard of. You want to know a smart kind of realpolitik? Doing the opposite would be better, but I'm not even saying you have to get on better terms with China to freeze Russia out. I mean, it doesn't make sense to enduringly freeze anybody with nuclear weapons out. But the smart play right now, for reasons I could go into, including the urgency of starting to think seriously about the governance of AI, the smart move right now would be rapprochement with China. And I think you're right. Trump has those kinds of instincts. He'll deal with anybody. And I am definitely delighted that we won't hear any more shit about democracy versus autocracy, this global struggle that Biden and Sullivan and Blinken and so many people are into. But when you fill the administration with the people he's filled it with, you've got all the people in Silicon Valley warning us about China so that they won't get regulated and so that they'll get government subsidies. And you've got almost everybody in every Washington think tank mindlessly repeating the mantra of an existential struggle with China. I'd be surprised if Trump could make progress there. My hat will go off to him if he does.
Yeah, I mean, that is the real tension. I mean, I think that's been an early tension and probably will be a driving tension throughout Trump's second term, is that he's sort of got these instincts that at times will push towards peace deals and things like that. But he doesn't really have the determination or the consistency or just the sort of ability to hold himself in control in order to make these things a little easier, right? Like he pushed for a ceasefire in Gaza. That's awesome. And then he spent the next month doing everything he could to undermine it, whether or not that was knowing. I think that we're going to see a similar pattern play out with Ukraine. And the problem is that opens a ton of space for the people who didn't want to see that in the first place, right? So if there's people that are spoilers in the administration, explicitly or implicitly, then that sets them up to bounce.
Yeah. I mean, I can imagine a scenario where Trump manages to make a claim in a couple of years that he did these two brilliant jujitsu moves, whether or not they were actually intentional, which I doubt they were. But I can imagine a world where he says, if I hadn't threatened to ethnically cleanse Gaza, although he wouldn't use that phrase, the Arab states would not have gotten together on a plan in Gaza that is now working. There could be an Arab state plan that's now working in 2 years in Gaza, for all we know. And then, you know, it wouldn't be crazy to say, you know, what jolted them into action was Trump saying all this crazy and disgusting shit about what he wants to do with Gaza. And similarly, you can imagine a world where Europe finally, and I definitely want this to happen, assumes more responsibility for security in their part of the world and for their own security. You know, one virtue of that, by the way, is I think in the long run, not right now. I mean, now they're probably in a pretty Manichaean frame of mind, many of them, but I think in the long run, being free from American dominance of their security policy would make them more likely to get along with countries like Russia, right? I mean, that's closer to being the default European instinct than it is to being the default American instinct, I think. So, you know, maybe Trump will say, you know, maybe his defenders will say, look at these two moves. God, he's a genius. I honestly think he just works on adolescent instinct, maybe, but still, these two things could work out.
Yeah. It's hard to say. I mean, I don't know. I could just see these both going in a dramatic number of directions. I could see the China stuff going really in any direction. There was one interesting line on this that I might bring up, and then maybe we can talk more about your AI things. But there was one thing that we do highlight in the in briefs of this week's Earth Thing is that the Chinese foreign minister has offered to Europe at the Munich Security Conference rather, to coordinate their global investment in infrastructure, basically. And so on the Chinese side, that's the Belt and Road Initiative. The European version has similarly, it's like global something. And what's really interesting about that is that John Kerry, when he was Secretary of State, apparently had a similar opportunity and very much regretted not partnering with China, which is just a really interesting part of when you think about like what the competition framework does to hurt us. Like this is a really key example, right? Because if the U.S. and China were cooperating on these global development issues, then it would have, one, just allowed for there to be more money. It would have allowed us to influence these things that we're now complaining about China doing. We claim that it's debt trap diplomacy, things like that. That's debatable, but that complaint wouldn't be there in the first place because we would have helped put these things in place. And then second, the fact of us not cooperating makes us see every single thing that China does in that area as, you know, a zero-sum problem, as something that we end up losing. And so it is an extra engine of competition, right? And so it's a missed opportunity in two ways at once.
Yeah, no, and it allows everyone to play the China card. As long as we consider China this existential threat, then we're expending apparently all these diplomatic and other resources to like pry Russia away. And, you know, I was just thinking, you know, like if I was wondering what happened when, who was it who just visited Saudi Arabia? It was Rubio or was it Waltz who just went
Both
to
there, yeah.
Yeah, and I was trying to imagine. I'm sure both Gaza and Russia came into the conversation, and China. And I was just thinking, like, if I was Prince Mohammed bin Salman, I'd be like saying, you know, I can get on a plane to Beijing tomorrow. Like, if you're serious, if you don't shut the fuck up about Gaza, this is greatly complicating my life. Okay, and not only will I not normalize with Israel, I'll be in Beijing in a nanosecond. And so long as we, I mean, this is like, I have these fantasies all the time that people will actually make these dramatic moves that of course they would never make. But as long as we define China as this inherent enemy, we are open to all of this kind of leverage. I mean, in a way, Europe is playing, you just described Europe kind of playing the China card.
Right.
And I'm fine with them doing that. I'm happy about it. It just shouldn't have to be that that's something that threatens us and that we try to discourage or something.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that was such a present dynamic during, you know, the first Cold War too, right? Where you saw, you know, I mean, for example, like Egypt, right, would kind of make signals that it might be willing to cooperate with the U.S. during the 50s. And then we'd provide, I think we ended up providing some financing to help with some infrastructure projects. And then they can go to the Soviet Union and say, oh, hey, we're getting some financing from the U.S. And then I think the Soviet Union completely financed the Aswan Dam project, which is this gigantic public works project in Egypt. And so, you know, you're just allowing other countries to kind of play you off your enemy. And you're setting yourself up in a bad position because your goal is to eliminate their influence everywhere, right? And if your goal is to eliminate their influence everywhere, then you're going to have to be very active about it.
Yeah. And some good comes of it, like some of these USAID programs. You know, it's true, a fair amount of USAID has been in the service of Cold War I or Cold War II or something as an extension of geopolitical influence. But some good stuff gets done that otherwise we wouldn't do. And then some stuff I'm not so wild about, like trying to plant the seeds for regime change. So some good can come of that. It just shouldn't be the criterion by which we decide, you know, whether to do these things.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, speaking of USAID, this what's your take on the status of the Musk? I saw some polling showing that Trump's favorability rating seems to have declined somewhat, and Musk's is significantly lower, like in the 30s. And I was thinking, I guess the one thing that could get Trump to distance himself from Musk would be if he starts to see him as a big political liability. But meanwhile,
or if he sees, I mean, the other version of that is that he's a political shield, right? That, you know, Musk is the guy running around messing up the government. If anything goes wrong, blame it on blame it on your billionaire friend, right? That, there's a certain way in which that's convenient. And it's also interesting. I saw some polling from YouGov. I think this was just the like panel they do, YouGov and The Economist. I don't remember, but it was from the past week, and it found that, there's a huge disconnect. They asked people to say, how much influence do you think Musk has in government? And the general consensus was a lot. And then they asked how much influence do you think he should have in government, and the general consensus was not a lot, right? So there is this tension. I don't think people want him to have this level of influence at this point.
Yeah, and it depends on how much attention people are paying, which sadly is usually pretty little. I mean, if you're paying attention, it's just a shit show. I mean, this thing about they came out and claimed they'd saved this amount of money.
Right.
And it's not just that they were way off. It's like the nature of the different errors together. So like in one case, it's like they said 8 billion. It turned out to be like, I don't know, 8 million or 80 million or something. It's like major decimal point problem. In other cases, it was like they were saying like, well, on this line item, we saved like, 300 million or something. And it turns out that this was a 10-year expenditure. 70%'s already been spent. So no, that's gone. You saved maybe 90 million or something. It's like there's several different kinds of errors that together just add up to the conclusion that these guys are not equipped for this job. And but I fear that not the kind of people I wish were paying attention to that are not. I mean, partly because of just the kind of tribalized media ecosystems, and partly because the average person's got a life to live and isn't all that focused.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was just going to add that, I mean, the really tricky thing with Musk that I think must end up being a problem at some point. We talk about this in an item in the newsletter. It's just like these conflicts of interest are really, really severe, right? Like he's currently a special government employee, which means that he is, these conflict of interest laws are applicable to him, right? I think that Trump can waive them. I don't think this will be a criminal question, but he is supposed to comply with these complex, conflict of interest laws. And when you've looked at examples of people, allegedly violating those in the past, right? Like a couple of years, there was an allegation that Eric Schmidt, the former Google CEO, had fallen afoul of those laws because he seemingly conducted some business in China while on an official government trip, or it seemed a little bit that way. And the evidence of that was Medium. There was all this stuff, and it was like, and it was a big deal. Politico wrote a whole piece about it. It was worth making a big deal about. But when you look at Elon Musk, I mean, it's really stark, right? Like just this week. So like last week he met with the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, had what by all accounts looked to be almost an official diplomatic conversation with him. And then this week, Tesla's posting job ads in Mumbai talking about expanding into the Indian market, right? Just this week, Vietnam, which has been in negotiations with SpaceX over putting Starlink into the country, decided all of a sudden that, Starlink is totally allowed. And they told Reuters, or people that were familiar with the conversation told Reuters, that Starlink is allowed because they're trying to get around tariffs. That is explicitly what they said. And even on top of that, you've got lawyers from X and Linda Yaccarino going around apparently threatening, and this is according to the Wall Street Journal, apparently threatening this major news like advertising conglomerate, and saying that if you don't put more ads on our platform, if you don't get your clients put more ads on our platform, then we are going to use our influence in the federal government. They didn't say this explicitly, but this was what they interpret it to be. Then we're going to use our influence in the federal government to block your merger that you're trying to do with this other company. And I mean, that's just genuinely unbelievable stuff.
There's more. You mentioned Reuters. So they canceled the security, DOJ canceled the security, the SEC's access to Westlaw, which is a legal database that you need access to, maybe because it is a Thomson Reuters property, and that Musk now has this war on government subscriptions to media, going back to the discovery that they were agencies were paying a lot for Politico premium or whatever the hell it is.
Right.
And some people think like, well, maybe they just got mixed up But in any event, the SEC no longer has that. They also canceled the SEC's Bloomberg terminals, which can, and maybe again, they saw the name Bloomberg, got mixed up with the media. But remember, the SEC fined Musk like a lot of money. I think was it tens of millions? I don't think it was hundreds. I think it was tens. Because of a very clear violation of regulations a few years ago. He tweeted that he had lined up financing to take, I think it was Tesla, private, and he specified the price that they were going to take it private at. So obviously the stock moves big time, which is okay if it's true, but if it's false, that's an obvious opportunity for Musk to give a few of his friends tips and let them make a shitload of money off of unsuspecting investors. And that's why it's illegal to make these declarations that are not true. Very clear violation. He gets fined, and now he's got a chance to punish the SEC. I mean, and whether intentionally or not, the SEC is getting punished. It's just, I don't know. I don't want to, but I'm surprised by how many people actually pay attention to this stuff and are, seem smart, are still saying kind things about Trump. The whole thing is just such a shit show. And again, look, if you want to cut the government, even if you want to fire this number of people, fine. If you have the legal authority to do it, do it. Why do you have to do it like this and cause so much fear and suffering among so many people and get so much stuff just wrong? And which is actually,
well, I think,
go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, well, I don't know if you were trying to segue there, but I mean, it's just been very interesting. I'm based out of DC, and I guess maybe the kind of the cruelty of it is a little bit the point, but it's shock and awe here, right? Like, I have some of my closest friends have lost work. Like half the people I know are either losing work or afraid they're going to lose work. It's going to be a huge impact on the DC economy. It's this thing that is just happening so suddenly that I think that the impacts of it are going to be very difficult to predict. It truly is demoralizing across the federal government, and especially across a lot of these that are just, to be honest, I know a lot of people that work in government, and a lot of them are actually much less political, right? And that's been sort of the interesting thing, is I think that there's this deep belief that Musk has, and maybe that some of the Trump people have, that the government is staffed with these lefty bureaucrats, and it's surely true to some extent. But at a deeper level, it's mostly staffed with pretty normal people that just kind of want to come to work every day, and a lot of them, and you're not really allowed to talk about politics in the office. You're not really allowed to do a lot of those things at basically all these agencies, and it's been really stark to see. I don't know, sort of just the callousness.
And it's not like they're making a ton of money. I mean, just the thought of all these people from Silicon Valley who are just awash in cash. Terrifying, and in many cases, rendering unemployed these people who have, a little trouble making ends meet. You don't make a ton of money as a civil servant.
No.
I mean, during Trump 1, I counseled calm and mindfulness. It's a little harder this time around. So I was going to segue to AI. Now, are we doing the overt transition to overtime, or do we wait and do what many podcasts do and decide we're going to impose that later?
Well, that's up to you. I'd say we've reached that point more or less. We've been talking for a little over a half hour. So if we want to do an explicit overtime now, that is not the worst time to do it.
I'll just tease this by saying I'm going to talk about some damage that even by the lights of some enlightened Trump-supporting libertarians, Trump seems to be doing to prospects for the AI thing working out well. And then I think you said, I haven't seen it, but you said there's an item in the newsletter having to do with, sounds like romantic intimacy with AIs. Right. There's been stuff about that, and I have some things I could say if they're not covered in what you have to say. And I mean, I could talk all day about AI, as you know.
Right.
So who knows what we'll get into.
Yeah, I might add one other topic that I do want to bring up is Israel has indicted 5 reservists for alleged abuse of Palestinian prisoners at a military base, and I think there's a lot of interesting sort of practical implications, international law implications about that I might want to get into. So that's my plug.
And also, I just read about this. I mean, not much to say, except that apparently Ukraine, inspired by what Israel did with the pagers to Hezbollah, has done a similar operation with drone goggles. Did you see this? I think this will get some airplay between now and by the time we post this, if it's true. But yeah, I mean, the idea is
dark.
some Russians who are operating drones, I guess, had explosions near their heads. I haven't gotten any details at all, but
Interesting.
That's
Anyway, well, that and more on the other side.
that, yeah. So stay away from those goggles.
This was a free preview of NonZero World. To unlock the rest of this conversation and other exclusive content, become an NZN member today at nonzero.org.